I just would like to welcome you all to the Middlesex County Museum and Historical Society's educational presentation by Dr. Julia King, who is amazing. But first, I just wanted to give you a little background on a committee that was formed in 2023 by the county, and it's the 250th committee. And Middlesex County Museum and Historical Society is a part of that committee, as are the other museums and some other entities. We are commemorating, it's the semi-quincentennial, so it is a long word, of the American Revolution, and the county museum is working on a display. If you walked in downstairs, you'll see the beginnings of it down there. We also like to acknowledge, with the 250th committee, the indigenous peoples of Virginia, and we express gratitude for their continued stewardship of her lands and waterways over many generations. We also acknowledge free and enslaved Africans and their descendants whose labors and contributions on behalf of the Commonwealth and of Middlesex County have long been overlooked. We commit ourselves to meaningful engagement with all citizens as we strive to tell the story, or the complete story, of the American Revolution and its promises against the backdrop of Middlesex County's long, rich, and diverse history. I didn't introduce myself, and you're stuck with me. I'm Marilyn South, the president of the museum. Now I'd like to introduce Right Reverend Bob Pritchard, who we are very, very fortunate to have as our vice president. So, Bob.
Not right. That's a bishop's title. I definitely am not a bishop, so I am a historian and a priest and a former teacher at Theological Seminary, and it is an honor now for the third time to introduce Professor Julia King of the University of St. Mary's in Maryland, the College of St. Mary's, Maryland. Sort of? Yeah. What is up? St. Mary's College, Maryland. Thank you. Third try. She has graduated from the College of William and Mary, from which she earned her first degree, from Florida State, where she earned a master's degree, and from the University of Pennsylvania, and is the head of the anthropology department at St. Mary's College, Maryland, but currently on leave to conduct the research about which she will be speaking with a grant from the National Humanities Center in Durham, North Carolina. She, on earlier occasions, has spoken about her work with the Rappahannocks tribe and about her work in archaeological digging in Middlesex County and the discovery of a site which indicates the habitation of two different Native American groups on the same general area. And we look forward today to hearing about work she has done in conjunction with the Pamunkey tribe in the Dragon Swamp, about the movement of Native American people into the swamp as a strategy to avoid capture and attack during Bacon's Rebellion, which began in 1675 or 6?
5 to 6.
5 or 6, okay. And we look forward for her presentation. Please welcome Julia King. Julie.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. And St. Mary's College is St. Mary's College of Maryland, so that people will realize that it is a state school and not a small Catholic girls' college. So let me see if I can get here. First of all, I'm going to present, but there are a number of people who have participated in this project, and you can see the Pamunkeys, the Rappahannocks, the Friends of Dragon Run, that made this project 100 times more revelatory and important than if I had just gone into it with my students. And so it's also a very complex story. How many here are familiar with Bacon's Rebellion? How many people? So and how many are really familiar with the complexities of Bacon's rebellion? A few people. And I will tell you, I've been working on this since 2022. And I just turned in a report to the National Park Service about how we spent this public money. And as I was putting this presentation together, I kept thinking, now what happened? How did that? Because there's so many threads and so much is going on in this particular event. I have my phone so I can keep an eye on the time, only because I would talk all night about this really cool project, because it is a very cool project. So let me go ahead and get started. And I'm going to start it out as a bit of a narrative. But we're going to go through and we're going to learn about the indigenous history of Bacon's rebellion. In many ways, it was all about the natives, right? Bacon wanted to wipe them out. He either wanted to kill them or enslave them, all of them. And he made a good start on it. But yet we don't hear as much as we might about the native role or the indigenous role in Bacon's rebellion. And by the way, I know that next year's the 250th. For Bacon's rebellion, it's the 350th. Although it is, I start with 1675. 1676 is when the rebellion broke out. So Virginia settler Thomas Matthew is refusing to pay Dogue Indians who live on the Potomac for goods or services they provided. And, Native people had their own judicial system, so to speak, so they came down and stole his hogs. And he got mad, so he retaliates by killing several of the Dogues. And then the Virginia militia runs after the Dogues and chases them into Maryland. So that's where we are in the fall of 1675. Meanwhile, this is from Augustine Herman's map of was published in 1673, but he did the field work a little bit before then. And you can see that these native houses, sometimes you see historians refer to them as cabins, and they're run into this area. And so the Virginia militia is after the Dogues. They get there and they start to insist that they think some Dogues are being hidden by Susquehannock people. Susquehannock people are originally from the Pennsylvania area, but they've been run out by the Haudenosaunee, and they've come to Maryland. Calvert, Lord Baltimore, had said, hey, look, you can come to Maryland, but you got to settle way farther up the Potomac than they did. They settled near the Piscataway, and that really upsets a lot of people. Meanwhile, but the Susquehannocks are there, and in a case of mistaken identity, the Virginia militia kills Susquehannocks and not Dogues. And the Susquehannocks do have a diplomatic relationship with the Virginia colony. So you can sort of see where this is all going. There's a great image because the Susquehannocks are very concerned. They retreat to their fort that is at the mouth of the Piscataway Creek on the Potomac River. And this great drawing shows, it survives in the archives in England. And you can see, as you look at this, you can see the Susquehannock fort. It's a square fort. They've adopted this method. Earlier, many of the forts were circular. They've got this square fort. You can see the cannon. The Maryland militia joined them, and you can see the militia camp to the bottom of the slide. And the Susquehannocks are invited out for a parley, right? A parley where you talk about things and arms are put down, right? And when they came out, I think it was Washington's great-great-grandfather, along with George Mason's great-grandfather, assassinated the Susquehannocks. And you can see why the Susquehannocks might be a little angry about that. So they retreat to their fort. Their leaders, I think there are 7 of their leaders that are killed. They hole up in this fort while they're under siege for like 6 weeks. They sneak out at night to get hogs or even horses to survive on. We're talking about men, women, and children that are in this fort. They finally escape on a moonlit night in early November 1675. And again, they're not happy, and they really shouldn't be at this point. And in fact, the Maryland government court-martials the members of its militia, but nothing really happens to them. They're sort of smacked on the hand, and meanwhile, the fort has become abandoned. So this map, and I had to pull some maps off of the internet because it's really good to have maps to see spatially what we're talking about. And if you look at the red star, that's about where the Susquehannock Fort was located on Piscataway Creek. This is today Prince George's County, Maryland. You might know Piscataway National Park. It's a national park today. And so the Susquehannocks, after they escape, they cross over into Virginia, and they go down, not the fall line, but just east of the fall line. And you know the fall line is at Richmond and Fredericksburg. They're just east of that. And they head on down, and they get to Bacon's quarter, Nathaniel Bacon. He's a newly arrived colonist. Now, there is a Nathaniel Bacon who is on the Virginia Council, and this is a kinsman of his who's a lot younger who has shown up, and he has his plantation at the Curls of the James, but he also has this quarter, and the Susquehannocks kill his overseer. And then Susquehannocks turn to the Rappahannock River, and they move into the Rappahannock River around where Port Conway is today, where 301 crosses the Rappahannock River, and everybody is leaving their towns. There are a number of native towns still in this area. In fact, the Rappahannock remains Indian country for a long time. So the natives abandon their towns. We don't know where they go. We can just tell archaeologically they're gone. The same for many of the few English settlers that are up there. People are very frightened. Governor Berkeley puts a couple of forts at the headwaters of these rivers, but they cost a lot of money. People are getting very angry, and of course Nathaniel Bacon moves in and takes advantage of this. And here are the main players that we read about. We see Governor Berkeley on the left, who was a longtime governor of Virginia. And I'm going to forget, so I'm not going to say the day when he first became the governor or the year. I got to hydrate all the time. You know how it is when you reach a certain age and when you get to be 40, like I am. And then you've got Nathaniel Bacon, and there are no images of Nathaniel Bacon, but these images, one is of what I call time drag, where people dress up and reenact events that you see in the bottom right. You can also see a painting that was done, I think, by Sidney King back in the day, where there's this confrontation between Berkeley and Bacon at Jamestown. And then you can see this other image on the right. And then in the lower left is Bacon's Castle, which is a property that's owned today by Preservation Virginia. If you have not been to Bacon's Castle, you need to put it on your dance card. So it becomes a standoff, and it rocks the socks off of Virginia. You saw how it sort of started by accident, and by maybe not accident, but people making bad decisions. And it's blown up into a full-blown confrontation where Bacon is saying we need to kill all the natives, and we need to enslave them. And that's a lot of what this is about, because before there was an African slave trade, there was a native slave trade. Now, we often think of the native slave trade as very minimal. It doesn't count for much, and it was dwarfed by the African trade. But it went on. It really ramped up towards the end of the 17th century. This is 1676. It's about the end of the 17th century. Everybody wants in on that trade. And that trade usually involves going into the interior and bringing captives out that are then either sent to the Caribbean or enslaved on Virginia plantations. But the violence that's committed by all parties, nobody is innocent of blood on their hands in the 17th century, really. So anyway, historians are really interested about this. I mean, Charles II is like, what, is going on? He ultimately sends over soldiers and he sends over commissioners to figure out what went wrong. Now, things are going on in other colonies at this time. So a lot of people have written that this is just sort of that time of the season. But we're going to stay focused on Virginia today. But what we don't often know or hear about are these native people. Now, we'll hear about them if we're driving down the road and we see these signs, these historical markers that often will mention that there was, that these people were impacted by Bacon, especially the Occaneechees. I'll get to them in a minute. But the clues are in the landscape around us. They're just not really in the documents. So this is another map that I pulled off of the internet. This is May of 1676. Remember, in January, the Susquehannocks have attacked people at the head of the Rappahannock River, January 1676. During that time, Bacon starts to mobilize. People in the Northern Neck want to join him because everybody is frightened. Native and settler, they're all frightened. So the first thing that he does, he wants to make war on the Pamunkeys, but he decides instead to go down to the southwestern portion of the colony and meet up with the Occaneechees. Now, the Susquehannocks had fled there after they had done all this depredations along the Rappahannock and other places. The Susquehannocks went down near the Occaneechees. Occaneechees didn't want them there. So Bacon comes down, and they join Bacon in pretty much wiping out the Susquehannocks. And then Bacon turned on the Occaneechees, and he corralled them into their fort, burned the fort. You can see that these are not necessarily fair war games going on. And then in August of 1676, and I'm really on the native part right now, Bacon decides it's time to go after the Pamunkeys. And that is what the focus of this project that I've been working on has been on mapping the dragon, which is really not that far away and I think forms one of your county's boundaries. Am I right? Yeah. So historians have written about this. I mean, people started writing about this in 1705. How many of you are familiar with Robert Beverley's History and Present State of Virginia? He talks about it in there, and he's on Berkeley's side. He's a loyalist. And in the end, Berkeley's side wins. There's a lot of Bacon rebels that are hung or had their property taken away. But Berkeley is also called back to England. He's older. He can't really handle things as well as at least Charles II thinks that he can. So starting in 1705, people have written about it. And those sources have become really important for us, and I'll show you a couple of those in a minute. But one of the most important ones that came out in 1976, I was in college at the time, we had to read it, American Slavery, American Freedom, where Edmund Morgan, a pretty famous Yale historian, argued that Bacon's rebellion became sort of this moment where people realize that we need labor, settlers realize we need labor, and we cannot depend upon native people or indentured people. That is, English people who have come over to provide that labor. And so he sees this as the beginning of African slavery. Historians have since really challenged that narrative, but he focuses on Bacon's rebellion. Then you have The Governor and the Rebel by William Washburn. That came out in the 50s, actually, so it's actually a little bit earlier. And he said, there was a guy named Thomas Jefferson Wertenbaker who said, oh my God, he was publishing, I want to say in the 40s, and he's like, oh my God, Bacon's Rebellion is sort of the foreshadowing of the American Revolution, right? 100 years later, we have the Revolution, and he tries to see all these parallels. Of course, nobody in the 1670s could look into a crystal ball and imagine an American Revolution. The settlers all wanted to be Englishmen. And then William Washburn comes along and he says, no, we shouldn't, no more than we can look into the future and see 100 years ahead of us. I mean, I don't want to see what's 6 months ahead of us, right? I'm living in my shell. And so anyway, Washburn says, we really need to bring the natives into this. But the natives are not represented very well in the documents, and that is a big problem. We see the Pamunkeys represented. We see Kokakoweski, who is the Pamunkey Werewanska, and that is the female version of the Werewants, which is the leader of the tribe. Now, if you guys are getting confused, I don't blame you, because there are so many threads to pull in here. It is an epic story. All the way up to Tales from a Revolution by James Rice. He was one of our consultants on the project. He too tries to bring in the native angle. But again, all these folks are relying on documents alone. And this is what they have to say. Washburn, who was very pro-native role in the story, says, the Pamunkeys like terrified children seeking to escape a drunken father. This makes it sound like they have no agency, that they're fleeing, they're running, that they don't know what to do. You have Thomas Wharton Baker, who was the guy who said this is a foreshadowing of the American Revolution. He's saying they fled their villages. Michael Leroy Oberg, who is actually a Native American historian, said, they chased the Pamunkeys into the heart of the dragon. Do you see how we're sort of getting this sense of Native people on the run? And we're not seeing what the Native people's role is in here. And then you've got Bradley Dixon. This book just came out in 2025, and he says, oh my God, Bacon leaves the dragon. He returns to Jamestown, and he's sated with plunder and prisoners. Well, you're going to see that sated is really doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Sated, as I understand sated, that's like after Thanksgiving dinner, right? That's not what's happening here. And it's simply because they only have the documents. So, and then here's the dragon, and this is Herman's map. And you can see I've got a little blow up here, and you can see where it says the swamp hereabouts is not passable nor inhabitable. So this shapes how we understand what's happening with the Native people, right? They're running into a swamp. I think I even have a swampy picture here. I mean, do you want to go live in the swamp? Who knows what's in there? And then where did the name the dragon come from? We wrote about that. We think we don't know. We don't know, but we think we have options, I should say. And so, who can make their way around a swamp? When we hear the word swamp, but if you're Native, you hear swamp and you hear grocery store. You hear something very different. It all comes back to Dominion energy, doesn't it? This is just a friendly reminder that your electric bill might be due in the next couple of days. But actually, it does come back to Dominion Energy. And of course, Dominion's mission is to provide electricity, and we are grateful for the air conditioning that we have here. They were getting ready to reconstruct what's known as Line 224. And that line crosses the Rappahannock River, but it comes through the Dragon. And I had heard about it right after I had been reading some stuff on the Pamunkeys and the Rappahannocks and Bacon's Rebellion. And if you look at this, you can see the Lenexa substation, which I believe is on the Virginia Peninsula. And you can see how it goes up to the King and Queen substation on across the Rappahannock. And they wanted to reconstruct this line. It's an old line. It needs reconstruction. You can tell by looking at those power lines that I sent to you, or that I showed you a couple minutes ago. And here it is shown in yellow. And here is where we think the Native people went. And you can see that line 224 cuts right through it, right? Here's the line 224. Now, I am the last person to say we shouldn't provide modern electricity to people. And especially, I was out in it on Tuesday, and I'm refraining from scratching my chigger bites and from, and the amount of heat that just exhausted me. I drove home and just went into the bed. So believe me, I appreciate the need for electricity. But because it is a regulated utility, right? It needs to take into consideration things like environmental and cultural things. Well, how do you find an archaeological site related to a rebellion? It's very hard to do. And Dominion, in fact, did a bit of archaeology along this line, even though the line already existed, and they were simply reconstructing in the line. But it made me realize that the dragon may not always be protected and pristine. So what I did was I put together a proposal for the National Park Service for the American Battlefields Protection Program. And that program does a lot for you to find out about battlefields so that they can be acquired, sometimes with federal funding, to be preserved. And we pulled together a team. We involved the Pamunkey Indian tribe, we involved the Rappahannock tribe, and we also involved the Friends of Dragon Run. And I hit the jackpot when I got all of these people together. You've often heard that two heads are better than one. Many heads are better than one. If I had just done this as a person at St. Mary's College with my students and staff, I don't think we would have arrived at the conclusions that we've arrived at, thanks to the input of people from many different walks of life. I will tell you this, though. Collaborative research is expensive. It takes a long time. I had to get an extension of a year on the grant, because you're trying to herd cats. People are very busy in the 21st century and just trying to get everybody together. And we did a lot of hiking. You can see up in the left-hand side. We also did a lot of kayaking. And I want to point out, and I hope that if there are other Dragon members here, I don't want to overlook anybody, but Carol and Jack pulled us over. I will never forget that February, when they're like, oh yeah, we kayak in February. And I'm like, just like I need air conditioning in the summer, I need that heat in the winter. But pulled us over these dams, and so that we could actually sort of get that hands-on feel of what it was like in the Dragon. We also met at the top, in the middle, members of the Pamunkey Indian tribe, council members, Wendy Robertson in the center, Allison Gray, and then to the right, that's the assistant chief of the Pamunkey, and then down below, this is we're meeting at the Rappahannock tribe with members of the Pamunkey. This was when a reporter from the Washington Post came and somehow figured out the story and published it. So if you need that link, I'm happy to provide it to you. But we had to do detective work. We knew that the records were thin. We knew that the records weren't going to show us exactly what had happened, right? You know, that the records weren't going to say, and the tribes went here, and Kokokoeski did this. There were tidbits, but not a whole lot. So what we did is we started off with the Dragon's watershed, which you can see here outlined in black. And we decided that was going to be our focus. We actually ended up having to extend that. We could have extended all the way over to Pamunkey Neck, but we realized that the Park Service wants us to tell them where are target areas for preservation. And if we said, oh, just the whole thing, they would have said, oh, we need that money back. And I want to start off with the 1669 census. This is like 7 years before. Now, we don't know how many Native people are there in 1676, but we can guess it's not too far off. And these censuses were only done on the counts of the warriors. So if you see, you've got the Mattaponi all the way down to the Machadocs who are on the Potomac. How many warriors are there? So we see that there's about 400 warriors. Well, how many people does that represent? Well, sociologists have come up, and genealogists have come up with figures to translate that. Like, how many people would you expect to be like a family associated with a warrior? And the figure that seems to be used by most of my colleagues is 4.25. So if you're looking at it, and I think all of these groups, remember, they're vacating their towns and they're going somewhere, and we don't know where they're going, and we think they're going into the Dragon. We're talking about almost 1,700 people. Even if it's an overestimate, 1,500 people, still a lot of people. Then we re-looked at some of the documents, right? They've got this May 3rd reference where Berkeley has gone to the fort at the head of the Pamunkey, and he's telling William Claiborne, you need to go find Coca-Coesky and tell her to go back to her town, because in April, she has left her town. Now remember, Bacon is on his way to the southwestern part of the state to attack the Susquehannocks and then the Occaneechees. But Coca-Coesky, she sees the writing on the wall. They all do. And she is already retreating into the dragon, where they're preparing the dragon as a kind of fortification, if you follow what I'm saying. They know that dragon. Bacon and his men do not. And they say that Colonel William Claiborne goes out and he finds the Pamunkeys, and he finds them encompassed with trees, which they had fallen in the branch of the dragon. And so this image is just to sort of give you a sense. It's actually not from the dragon, but to give you a sense of a kind of brush fort. Now, it's very interesting that Bacon could not find the Pamunkeys, but Claiborne could. That's a clue. Then we looked at local history. Some of you may be familiar with this local history. It was written in 1957 by a guy named Ed Cox. He lived at a historic house in King and Queen County. And in there, he says Bestland was a 10,000-acre patent of Colonel William Claiborne in 1662. The name has continued. You may know Bestland. You can drive through it today. This was the refuge of Queen Coca-Coesky of the Pamunkeys during Bacon's rebellion. Now here's the thing. Mr. Cox says, and this is very well cited, and then he doesn't give us any citations. Thank you, Mr. Cox. And so, and the only place we could find a copy of this that we could borrow was from the Mormon church, from the church because of the genealogy. So we borrowed it and we made a copy. You can also look at it at the King and Queen Historical Society, but we wanted it so that we could just do that, detective work with the magnifying glass. We treated this as oral history. 1957 is probably a lot less development, and that people are telling stories that probably have some grounding in truth. Oral history is always kind of suspicious because we remember wrong. We can all probably recall some incident where we accused a younger sibling of something and then found out we remembered wrong, right? But it is still extremely valuable. Then we looked at land patents. You can pull them, they're all online, they're at the Virginia State Library, and you can see where we have mapped out some of those patents today. And you can see Bestland. Let's see if I can get this guy to work. Here's Bestland up here. And then all of these land patents that we found descriptions for. Now, it may not be perfect because mapping this kind of stuff takes a long time. We do it in GIS, Geographic Information Systems. And you can also see, and I'll just head on to the next one, we also were able to map Indian paths. Because check this out. You have in the land patents, an ancient Indian ferry on the Mattaponi at these small oaks by an Indian path, thence west to the Indian path. So we're able to get these points, and then we connect them. We see that a lot of them today are under macadam and CR6 gravel, right? They're roads today, not all. And check this out. You can see that the upper Mattaponi path here is really just going right through Bestland. The natives are probably, and not just Coca-Coesky, but the Rappahannocks, the Potobagos, the Nansemons, the Mattaponis, the Chickahominies, and the Pamunkeys are probably accessing the dragon through these old Indian paths. Then there's diplomacy and familial ties. This is an image that Pamunkey artist Ethan Brown, and I think it's owned by the King and Queen Historical Society, did of Coca-Coesky. But we know that Coca-Coesky, I shouldn't say we know, because again, we have to read the documents subversively. But we know that she had a child, probably had a child, with a lot of certainty, had a child with Colonel John West. And if you look at how John West is treated in Bacon's Rebellion, it makes total sense. And she names that child Captain John West. Captain is his first name. And whenever she is summoned to Jamestown, she takes her son with him. He signs the Treaty of Middle Plantation that brings Bacon's Rebellion to an end. And you can tell that he probably can speak, and I think he can speak English. The assembly gets mad because she pretends she can't. It was very common among Native groups to create these kinship ties to other groups as a diplomatic practice. I bet you it's true for the English as well, too. I mean, if you look at those royal people back in the 17th and 18th centuries and before them. And so she has this son, and this son is probably fathered by John West, who West Point is named for. And he is immediately thrown into prison. I wonder why. Because they don't want him going and telling Coca-Coesky what's going on, right? What their plans are. And he is in prison for the duration of Bacon's Rebellion, and they take over his property and set up camp there. These are the rebels. And then there's the story of Coca-Coesky's nurse. Now, I need to drill down into this name, nurse. I assume it is sort of like an attendant, a lady in waiting. I don't know if these words translate very well, but she is captured. She is seen and captured by Bacon's forces, and they want her to lead them to Coca-Coesky. And she says, I'll do it. And so what she does is she leads them on a wild goose chase. For a day and a half, 36 hours, she leads them out of the Dragon over to where the Rappahannocks town was at the time, which they have vacated. They finally realize that the rebels realize they've been had, and they kill her. They knock her on the head, and they just throw her body out onto a path. But and this is where I need to bring in one of the colleagues that worked on this project. His name was Jeff Wright, who is a retired military intelligence person. I had no idea I had this person with these skills on this team, but he happens to be the president of the Friends of Dragon Run. And so he could bring in all of this war game kind of information that I'm not a military historian in any way, shape, or form. And he just glommed on to what this nurse was doing. She was a female. She knew she was probably going to be killed in the end, but she is the phrase that President Wright uses is trading space for time. In other words, she's leading them out of the Dragon, and that gives the Native people in the Dragon more time to relocate, to evade Bacon's rebels. And trust me, Bacon's rebels, they were whining, they were complaining, there was no morale, they were miserable. It was pouring rain in the Dragon. Meanwhile, tobacco and corn in the fields outside of the Dragon were like burning to a crisp. And the settlers even said that these are the sorceries of the Indians. Then finally, Bacon starts out with, I want to say, 500 people. And he tells them, you can go home. And so a lot of them go home, and he ends up with about 136 people. At 8 a.m., the remainder who are leave on this morning. Do I have the morning up there, the date? It's sometime in August. And he comes across the Pamunkey camp. And you can see here, after 3 hours, after it's just Bacon and his 136 rebels, fell upon the Pamunkey Indians encamped beyond a small branch of a swamp, with swamp both on their right hand and left, which was fine champion ground, which is level ground, good soil, level ground, though full of thickets which hid the Indians. There are some clues in here. Now, I'll tell you, I'll be the first to say a small swamp, what was it? Small branch of a swamp doesn't really narrow it in the Dragon when it's 90,000 acres, but it does narrow it. And this is how it helped us narrow it. Do you notice these circles? So you see the Dragon, and you see the various swamps that feed it. And these circles represent areas where two runs come together where you have a swamp on one side and a swamp on the other. Do you see? I mean, we think this is pretty good. Remember, we're trying to read these, we're trying to pound as much out of these documents and environmental information that we can. And also, meanwhile, the Friends of Dragon Run are doing viewshed and soundscape analyses. Like, how far do you have to be away from somebody before you can't hear them? How far away can someone be before you can't see them? You know, you can cloak yourself and you can watch people far away. They cannot see you. All of this makes up the final report. So here's Bestland. This is the area of Bestland. Unfortunately, the people who own Bestland have not allowed us access to the property. I hope that will change, or at least the properties in this particular area. And then I want to show you this area, White Marsh, because then I went and drilled down into the archaeology records that the state of Virginia keeps in Richmond. And I found this. I found, and you'll see I don't have White Marsh. Here's the main stem of the dragon. Here's White Marsh. And notice that there are a number of native sites here. And they have artifacts that probably aren't associated with Bacon's rebellion. But when you see pottery and flakes, this tells you they know about that place, right? They'll go to places that are familiar to them. And what I really liked about this is, check this piece out. You know, it's like you've got the swamp. I mean, is this the place? I don't know. Hopefully we'll be able to, at some point, get to do some archaeology, because you always have to ground truth. You know, that is, you can create your model, but your model has to be ground truth. So there's that particular area. Meanwhile, as for Bacon and his army, you know, and in fact, Bacon ends up dying in October from dysentery, and also he has lice, what he calls the lousy disease. And he dies, and the rebellion continues. It even ramps up a little bit, but it is petering out by the end of December. We think that the native people stay in the dragon through this whole time. If you've driven around the dragon, you know that it's not all swamp. There's some good land. We know they were there in April. We know that they've probably prepared it, and they don't want to come out because everybody has objectives. Bacon's objective, get rid of the tribes, kill them or enslave them. And the objectives of the native people is protect and sustain the citizens of their nations, and withdraw and evade, and trade that space for time. In other words, just let this thing play itself out, which was actually a very smart move. And Koweski, by the way, said to her warriors, do not fire on the English, on the settlers. Do not fire. And that serves her very, very well when there is a treaty that's formed. So we don't think that if Bacon's men died, they died through other means. They could have gotten dysentery or friendly fire, who knows? It's very hard to figure out who of Bacon's men died in the dragon. So I'm going to now give you something that I tell my students don't ever do in my class, and that is use words on a slide. You know, where like their notes, you know, students can do this. They'll put their notes up there to remind themselves, but I'm doing it because I want you all to see the upshot of this project. First of all, the various nations, it wasn't just the Pamunkeys. The records preserve the Pamunkeys' voices, but they don't preserve all these other voices, and yet we're pretty sure that they're in the dragon. And remember, they're probably all in some kind of diplomatic relationship with one another. And if you know anything about 17th century native politics, these are people that didn't always get along, just like states don't always get along. And so, but they're getting along because they have to. They plan to temporarily locate in the dragon. They approach the dragon the same way they do their winter hunting camps. Their homes are mobile. And as the fall and winter come, they're moving to their winter hunting camps and taking everything with them. This is not a big charge on them. Sure, it's unplanned, but it's part of what they know how to do. They have what a lot of people today call traditional ecological knowledge. The dragon serves as a sort of fortification, right? You know, people can't figure their way around in it, or at least the settlers can't. It was an environment the natives knew well. And that puts them at a distinct, what we call homeland advantage from the settlers. They lure Bacon away. They abandon their towns in Pamunkey Neck. Bacon would have loved to have found them at their towns. He would have killed them and burned them out and enslaved them. But they've left, and they're luring him into the dragon. And it is a wholly unfamiliar environment to them. The discipline. The majority of people remember it was like 400 warriors maybe when we were sort of guesstimating. The majority of people are men, women, and children, and many of these are elders, like the nurse who is older, and yet they managed to evade Bacon's forces. And most surprising, he did not burn their towns in Pamunkey Neck. That was like the settlers' go-to, burn the towns, right? Because you destroy the infrastructure. So I'm getting close to wrapping up. This is where we are showing, and by the way, 8 or 9 Native people out of an estimated 1,700 were killed. 45 were taken prisoner. They probably were sent back to their tribes afterwards by Charles II. This doesn't sound to me like Bacon was sated with prisoners and success. 8 or 9 is like less than 1% of 1,700. So right here this is what Jeff Wright tells us we're going to call the battle space, and this is the sanctuary space. This is where the natives are. They're hiding from him. Here's Chapel Creek. That's where the nurse, if you recall, leads the rebels when she's convinced them she's going to take them to Cocoquesky. They never captured Cocoquesky. That was the prize, and Bacon never captured Cocoquesky. And that wraps up my presentation. There is way more to be said, and here are our people who helped us with this project, and I would be happy to answer any. Get it to go. How's this? Is it back? That's a miracle that I could figure out which button to push. All right, well, thank you very much, and if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Small technical point. If there are, since we don't have microphones in the audience, if you repeat the question,
Oh,
make sure
okay.
we can record it.
I think I've settled it for everyone, though. Jack?
You hinted that there might be some kind of preservation area as a result of this. Is that a possibility?
Well, what we're going to say to both the Virginia Department of Historic Resources and to the National Park Service is that any land in this area, and I realize that it's not narrowed down, but that a second look should be given to it for preservation. Now, one thing you need to know about preservationists, if you're not in this field, we know we can't preserve everything. We can't put up a wall around these boundaries and say, don't do anything. But what we can do is, as properties come on the market, they can be evaluated, right, as ways to sort of protect that history. We have Bacon's Castle in Surrey County, and people can go there and learn about Bacon's Rebellion. They can go to Jamestown and learn about Bacon's Rebellion. There's really no place they can go and learn about the indigenous role. So there's some hope that at some point the tribes, as they're, chugging away with their federal recognition, will build that capacity to incorporate it into their narratives that they tell people. Because it's really, as Jeff Wright says, it's an epic story that deserves to be told. And it really just comes from, inverting the evidence and looking at it in a really different way.
Where is the King and Queen Courthouse on that map?
So the question is, where is the King and Queen Courthouse? And I just cannot tell you that. It's somewhere, isn't it somewhere over in up, tell me. Right here? All right, we're going to pin the tail on the courthouse. It does.
The courthouse is just slightly below Manapike. It's outside of that red circle,
Okay.
but it's just downriver from Manapike.
Okay, for those at home, this is Mantapike, and the courthouse, the King and Queen Courthouse is in this general location. All right. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Dr. King, what did you learn from the tribal contributions to this project to help you with your search for information about this?
It depended on who in the tribe we were talking to. For example, when we talked to men from the Rappahannock tribe who were hunters, modern day hunters, they could tell us all about things that they look for as hunters in the dragon. We were all out on a walk. And then, like what ground covers best to walk on to be quiet. How far you can see, calls. And by calls, I mean communicating with other people. And we know that these tribes continue to have these calls as early as the 1920s because an anthropologist, Frank Speck, writes about it. And so we learned a lot that I would have never really thought about that avenue to go down. Now, if it was a member of the tribe who was a historic preservationist, we would then maybe learn more about, well, here's land that we've already identified, that kind of thing. So it was many flowing pieces of information that were just coming together into this sort of centrifuge and, trying to make sense of it.
It doesn't sound like a clear line of oral tradition.
No. Yeah, no. And it never is a clear line of oral tradition. And I've done a lot of oral history with non-tribal people in Maryland. I don't know if any of you know the Patuxent River Naval Air Station, but we did oral histories with people when that facility that was built in the 1940s, and we could tell from the records that people were remembering incorrectly, but their memories were so strong, right? And so there's always grains of truth in there. But unfortunately, if you look at the history of Native people, how many of you have heard of Walter Plecker? Yeah, a few people have heard of Walter Plecker. Walter Plecker was the head of the Bureau of Social Statistics. In 1924, Virginia passed this law called the Racial Integrity Act that said there were no Indians left in Virginia. And so basically there was this effort to try to beat the Indian out of the person. And this didn't just happen in Virginia, it also happened across the country. It's something we now I think everyone regrets, not just Native people. And if you've ever seen the movie, is it Virginia versus Loving? About the Loving story. That was the law that they were challenging. It was the Racial Integrity Act. So, other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I maybe missed this in your presentation, but did the area around the Dragon Run, was that part of the Pamunkey territory, or was it used by all the Indians at the time? Was it a hunting area? Why were they going there originally? Was it to hunt, or was it shared space, or did one tribe own that area or claim it?
So the question is, did one tribe own the dragon? And by own, you know what I mean. Yeah, it was their territory. And that is actually a great question because we know from the records that the Chickahominies and the Pamunkeys and the Rappahannocks engaged in group hunts. If you remember when Captain John Smith was up in the Chickahominy River in 1608, Do you remember reading about that? I mean, I'm not that old, so I don't actually remember it. But when he was captured, it was a joint hunting expedition. And that may be what's going on in the Dragon. Now, here's the problem. There's been very little archaeological survey in the Dragon because it's not developed. You know, the Virginia Peninsula, Williamsburg, Newport News, that whole area. There's been so much survey in that area. And that's what we need, is that kind of survey to say where people are. But at this point, I would say if I had to pick one, and never bet on what I say I have to pick, because I just found out a couple weeks ago that what I was absolutely sure about with Rappahannock history, I was wrong. But if I had to pick, I would say it was more of a communal hunting area. Yes, sir.
Dr. King, I found it exciting and really kind of extraordinary that you gave this presentation without really any reference to the Emperor Powhatan and the monkey being on the edge of state formation and the sort of traditional presentation of where the Algonquian Empire state was in 1550, and the role of Powhatan and Pocahontas and their descendants in that phase and that anthropological
Yeah.
structure or interpretation. I wonder if you'd be able to give us a brief commentary on why you abandoned it without even mentioning.
Well, the question is, why didn't I mention about Powhatan being, Wahan Seneca being the leader of this paramount chiefdom that the settlers encountered when they arrived in 1607. And the reason I left it out is I felt I was bringing together a lot of threads, right, and really wanted to focus on 1676. But I will tell you that that is a very complicated story about the paramount chiefdom. And I'll tell you that an article I recently wrote, for decades, people believed that the Powhatan Empire spread over the entire Tidewater portion of Virginia and even went into Maryland. If you look at John Smith's map, he shows Powhatan in there. There are narratives that suggest that one of the reasons that all the Rappahannock towns are on the north side of the river is because of fear of Powhatan conquering them. And at the site that Bob Pritchard has on his property that we excavated, we found evidence, I'm convinced, of Powhatan's conquering of the Kecoughtan that were moved over, that came over to the Rappahannock. But if you go into it subversively, I don't know that the Rappahannocks were part of that empire. But it is a fascinating story. By 1676, Coca-Coesky, who's descended from Wahan Seneca, it's a very different world. I mean, there have been 3 Anglo-Powhatan wars, 1622, 1644. So, but I'm happy to provide resources, or maybe you know already these resources. But that too is an epic story. So, yes, sir.
Was there, after this period, was there any retribution by the tribes against the settlers, like King Philip's War up in Massachusetts area?
Retribution by the settlers against the natives, or the natives against, well, there was the Treaty of Middle Plantation that acknowledged indigenous sovereignty, and it also restored possessions to Coca-Coesky. It gave her that bronze medal that I think the Pamunkey tribe still own today. But in the end, if you read James Rice's Tales from a Revolution, what Bacon did, even though Bacon didn't win in this case, Bacon's goal became Virginia and then North American policy. So there was no retribution from the natives against the, I mean, there might have been pockets here and there. There was a murder up on the Rappahannock at Nanzatico in 1705. You guys might know about this. All the Rappahannocks all the Nanzaticos were gathered, marched to Jamestown, and then put on a ship to the Caribbean. And so you can see the slavery still going on. Any other questions, Bob? And then I'll get to you.
Did you dig any test pits at those locations that you thought were
No.
possible?
We didn't because it wasn't really an archaeology grant, and archaeology is labor intensive. And before you can go and dig, you really need to get buy-in from all the parties, including the tribes. So we used existing archaeological data, right, that we found in the Virginia state files, but we didn't actually go out and do any digging. We did walk some properties that people would allow us to walk. We looked at one guy's collection. He lives on Contrary Swamp, and he had some suggestive stuff, but not enough. He also had a lot of rocks that really weren't native rocks, right? He had just been picking them up on his farm for years. Yes, ma'am.
This is kind of a general question. When you did this project, and when you're kind of reporting on all this information for this thing, and you're taking some of it from the Native Americans, and is that as recorded by the settlers from that time, or do the natives themselves, I'm making an assumption that may be wrong, but they didn't write their languages, right? It's all oral tradition when it comes from that side of the story.
I think it is a lot of oral tradition. Well, let me restate the question. So, and you tell me if I got your question right. Your question is, is it all oral tradition that's coming from Native people, or is there any written?
Yeah, is there any written on their behalf, or are we taking a lot of this from what the English-speaking settlers wrote as it happened?
So I do want to mention that when the commissioners came, they interviewed Coca Koweski, and she gave them, they repeat her words. But remember, it's coming through a lens, right, that they're writing. And then the other point about that is Coca Koweski talks about how she plays into that English understanding, how they were terrorized, and I'm sure they were terrorized, but she doesn't acknowledge any of her own very skillful diplomatic, or her diplomatic skills, because she's trying to get things restored to her. And so we do hear, she talks about the nurse. She talks a little bit about how they almost discovered her, and she fled, and she was in the woods for, I think, 2 weeks, and all she had to eat was a turtle leg. But we suspect that that's not true based on the ecology of the dragon in August. So,
So when you're talking about her narrative, that's as written and by the settlers.
it is.
Yeah, okay.
It is. And we don't discount it. I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if we threw out the English writings, we would be,
You have nothing, right?
we would have a lot less.
Right, right, yeah. Thank you.
Of the lands that you are interested in, what percentage of it is privately owned now? Is any of it federal land? Is it supposed to have it acquired or set aside?
I didn't include the slide, but you would be surprised. You can go to, I think it's DCR website. You can download the lands that are preserved and protected. There's Dragon Run State Forest. And then a lot of farmers are really interested in preserving their agricultural lands. The Friends of Dragon Run own some land. So there is a lot more preserved or protected than I thought there would be. If you guys know where the John Smith marker is in Middlesex County, I think. That is probably not too far away from where some of the nations were in 1676. So the question was about preserved lands and how much is preserved in the dragon. And the answer is there's a lot. There can always be more, right? Because we want our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to see and imagine. There's nothing like a landscape that can help you imagine what happened in the past, even if you're not grounded in that cultural knowledge. So, any more questions, or and you tell me when you think we should, because like I said, I could stay here all night. Yes.
So this may be off the wall, but it goes to the comment you just made. Could you all use drones to look at some of high-ground sites?
That's actually a great question. But we don't use drone. I mean, drones are great to sort of show you what's going on a piece of property if you can't get access. But LiDAR is even better. I don't know if you guys know about LiDAR, but LiDAR shows differences in elevation. We don't think they built a fort. LiDAR can actually show you, in areas where there are sustained fortifications. We don't think that's what's going on in here, but who knows, I mean, like I said, I last week I would have told you something about a certain bit of Rappahannock history, and then when I was out in the field on Tuesday last week, it just inverted it totally, and when you ground truth, you find more. So the question was about using drones. So are we good to go, or?
We encourage you all to ask questions, from Dr. King. She is so knowledgeable. So if you all are comfortable, we'll let Dr. King head on.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
So we thank you all. Please visit MiddlesexMuseum.com. That was great. You guys always do a great job. Enjoyed it. Want a photo?
Oh, that kind of photo. I thought you meant like a photo. I was like, you have a photo.
Is the line
If I don't send Tom a photo, I'll get in trouble.
Dominion